Okay, so I'm just going to take you through a start to finish scenario of how law enforcement locates a cell phone, and this is like your most typical scenario. There's lots of different scenarios, but this is most common. So the first step is law enforcement needs a suspect and a cell phone number in order to track. The most typical way is arrest someone on the bottom and interrogate them to get to someone on the top. So this particular arrest scenario probably isn't happening anywhere around here, but definitely in other parts of the country. This guy gives up the phone number. So next step is law enforcement will use something called the Local Number Portability Enhanced Analytical Platform. This is just a database that's set up for law enforcement, and they'll enter in a suspect's phone number and they'll find out who the service provider is. And this is software, this is a database that law enforcement accesses through PenLink software. So if anyone who's ever done any research with cell site simulators and public records requests where local law enforcement purchases Stingray equipment, sometimes they'll see references to PenLink. So this PenLink software is used by law enforcement to do different things, and this is one of the things that it's used for, to look up these numbers to find out the service provider. So once they learn the service provider, in this scenario, it's Verizon Wireless, they will issue a subpoena to get subscriber information. And there's no, in federal court, there's no judicial oversight. They don't have to go to a judge to get it approved. It's just an administrative subpoena. They'll issue it to the service provider with the phone number, and typically they'll respond with something like this. It gives them the name, the address of the person whose phone it is, the billing information, that sort of thing. And also it will give them the identifying serial number for the phone, and this is either a serial number for the SIM card going into the phone, or it will be the hardware serial number of the phone. And this is important later on when they want to precisely locate the cell phone. So once they get general information, the name of the cell phone user and their address and everything, they'll continue on with the next step, which is to issue a court order or warrant to get real-time location information on the phone. And this is sent, again, to the service provider. And the reason why they ask service providers for this information is because, as a lot of you probably know, in order for your phone to work, it needs to connect to cell towers that are positioned around cities and wherever else. So each one of these cell towers has a physical address. So if the phone is connecting to a cell tower, they know that the phone is within range of that cell tower. So before law enforcement can go about using their own equipment like a Stingray, they need to know the general area where the phone is located so that they can drive out there and use the equipment. So there's actually two types of real-time information on cell phones that you can get from the service provider. The first type is just the antenna tower and sector of which the phone sends its signal. And the most typical cell tower has 3 sectors that cover 120-degree area of the signal coverage area. So this red area that you see on the screen is where a phone would be located, and that's kind of like about how precise it would get. It all depends on how far of a range any particular tower is servicing. If it's going a long range, it's not going to be too precise. If it's something really small, some cell towers just service a building. So sometimes law enforcement can get precise enough information to locate a phone just with one of these orders, but it is pretty rare that that would happen. I've actually never heard of any case where that's happened. Another type of location information that law enforcement can get from service providers is the same type of information that would be transmitted to 911 if you ever call 911 from your phone. So this gets more precise. It either uses the GPS on your phone. So if you want to get an idea of how accurate it gets, you can kind of just look at the GPS on your phone, and that will tell you how precise law enforcement could locate you. Other technology will use adjacent cell towers. They'll use triangulation to kind of calculate where you're at But I think all the providers now are using GPS, and they'll fall back on the cell towers if the GPS isn't too accurate, or they'll use a hybrid of the two. But the FCC requires 50 to 300 meters, depending on the technology used. But this is a real-world example of AT&T providing information to law enforcement on a real-time cell site or real-time cell phone information order, and it was only as accurate as 1,057 meters of minor access. So it really doesn't get too precise. It all depends on where the phone is located. You know, if you're deep in a building somewhere, then your GPS isn't going to be working too well, if at all. And in that case, it's going to be a lot more difficult for law enforcement to locate the phone. So this probably rarely accurate enough for law enforcement, so they need to move on to the next step, which is to use a cell site simulator or Stingray. So first, hopefully they get a court order or a warrant to do this. A lot of times they're kind of masked. They don't describe the technology too well. It's difficult to tell if that's what law enforcement actually did, but there's certain keywords like duplication of facilities. I've highlighted that here. Other ones are you know, I've seen some references to cell site simulator, but it's pretty rare. Once they get one of these orders to use their own equipment, they'll go out. Well, actually, let me get into what actually a cell site simulator is. It's a miniature mobile cell tower operated by law enforcement, and it's without the knowledge of the service provider, and it forces all compatible cell phones in the area to connect to the equipment. And its purpose is to identify the phones and to locate the phones with high precision. So it's going to get a lot more precise than if they're just relying on the real-time cell site information or E911 type stuff. And it does masquerade as a legitimate service provider cell tower. So they're going after like a Verizon phone in this scenario. That's what they're doing. It's actually going to have to pretend to be a Verizon cell tower. It's going to transmit certain codes that will trick people's phones into thinking that it's a Verizon tower and cause phones to connect to it. So this is what the equipment looks like. This is the heart of the equipment. These are base transceiver stations. They have software-defined radio slices and other connectors for plugging in antennas and things like that. These are pictures of directional antennas that law enforcement uses. So unlike a typical cell tower that has antennas that are intended to provide cellular service, these antennas are intended to locate the phone. So that's what they're specifically designed for. And then there is the laptop or handheld controller to operate the equipment. And this is a screenshot of some software that's used to locate the phone. This is by DRT. So in basic terms, it's the base transceiver station, the directional antenna, and the laptop controller equals a service provider cell tower. So it can be deployed in 3 different ways, either on the road with the road vehicle, or on a plane or a helicopter, more likely a plane than a helicopter, or they can be carried on foot. They have handheld ones or ones that you can put in a backpack. So going back to our scenario of locating a phone, while receiving that real-time information from the service provider, which is actually fed through email, and they use Penlink software to collect these emails that come in real time from the service provider, and it's overlaid on a map, and it basically gives them an idea of where the cell phone is located. So they'll get a police vehicle, they'll load it up with the Stingray, directional antenna, computer, and they'll drive out towards where the service provider is telling them where the phone is located. And once in that area, they're going to drive around waiting for that specific target phone to connect to the equipment. Because again, the equipment is, in this case, it's a Verizon phone. The equipment is pretending to be a Verizon cell tower, and cell phones are going to connect to the tower that's providing the strongest signal or pretending to provide the strongest signal. There's ways to fake that. So that's what law enforcement relies upon. And they're going to drive around in that general area where the service provider told them where the phone was located, waiting for the phone to connect to their own equipment. But the main problem with this is that it's also going to cause all other phones in the area to also connect to this equipment, even if they're not targets of the investigation. So if they're going after a Verizon phone, then all Verizon phones in the area are also going to register with this law enforcement equipment. And this is actually something that has to be done if they're going to zero in on the target. So what this equipment does is when the phones connect, they're going to collect all of the serial numbers on each one of these phones. Again, it's either the serial number on the SIM card or on the phone hardware itself. It doesn't really make a difference. And they collect these numbers, and then they'll go back to that subpoena where they were given the identifying serial number on the target phone, and they're going to run a check to see which one of these phones that's connecting to the equipment is the phone that they're after. So in this case, there's a match on the number that they got from the subpoena. So at that point, they're going to tell all of the non-target phones to disconnect from the equipment, and they're going to hone in just on that target phone. And during that time, they're going to cause it to transmit an abundance of signals that they can measure and conduct geolocation techniques using the software on the laptop that's connected to the cell site simulator. And back to this slide here, this is a major privacy concern because although they're not locating these phones, these third-party innocent bystander phones with their equipment, they're still logging the serial numbers. And you know, there's been a lot of talk on whether or not they keep this data. There's been a lot of push to get law enforcement to change their policies to say that they're going to delete data on the third parties once they're done with the location operation. But you know, we really don't have any way of knowing if they're doing that, and it would be easy for law enforcement to deploy this equipment without us knowing, because again, they don't need to get in contact with the service providers. They can run it on their own. There's really no need for them to contact anyone in order to operate it. They could go to a protest and use this equipment and just log everyone's identifying information off of a phone, their serial numbers, and then go back and maybe submit subpoenas to the service providers, which again, don't have any judicial oversight. They're just administrative subpoenas if you're in federal court, and they can collect the names, addresses of everyone who's at that protest. So I think that's one of the major privacy concerns with this equipment. There's no record of that ever happening, but the thing is that if it did happen, there really is nothing in place that would create a record of that unless somebody just happened to find out about it or law enforcement were to voluntarily say that that's something that they did. Back to the scenario of locating this suspect, this target cell phone. If it's a road vehicle with the cell site simulator, it's in like a dense urban area, it's probably only going to locate down to a single building. So what they'll do is they'll park outside with the cell site simulator running, and they'll deploy handheld portable wireless device locators. And these are actually passive. They don't connect with the phone. They just rely on the Stingray, the cell site simulator, to connect to the phone, and they kind of piggyback off of that network. And it allows law enforcement to go into the building with these handheld kind of like homing devices, and they'll go around, they'll stand in front of every door, every window, kind of measuring the signal that's going between the Stingray parked out front and the phone inside the building. And this is testimony from an investigator, and he basically explained this, that he stood in front of every door, every window, determining the direction of where the signal was coming from. So this is how we know. You can kind of piece it all together from different cases. The law enforcement will testify from time to time and release a little bit here, a little bit there. These are pictures of some of the equipment. These are by KeyW Corporation. These are the handheld devices, and I've actually seen law enforcement in the U.S. purchase these. So this is basically what they're using. And then once they go into the building, they can get the precise location, and at that point, they'll either go in and arrest the person if they're a fugitive, or maybe they'll secretly log the location, go back to the court and get a search warrant to search the house to collect further evidence. So that's basically how it works. There's other scenarios, but that's the most common one, and some of the privacy implications of that as far as affecting the third parties. I've got a second part of this presentation, if there's time. Yes. Okay. This is exploiting weaknesses in law enforcement liaison policy employed by cellular service providers. So this is a phone number. Nobody should call this number because this is actually a number that's only used by law enforcement. This is basically a customer service number for AT&T. Whenever law enforcement issues a subpoena or a court order and they want to check up on it, they have this 800 number. It's 24/7. They call it up and they ask about, what's the status of my order? Is there any data coming in? It's just the same as if you were to call up AT&T and ask about your bill. Instead of that, this is just specifically for law enforcement. Now, I don't know if this number is in service. I've never called it. Again, I'm not saying anybody should call it, but there's the number on the screen. So, again, anyone can but shouldn't call it. There is no check. There's no, at least as of May of 2015, there was no check. There's no, code you have to type in, or they don't ask you who you are or anything like that. There's no vetting whatsoever. This is specifically an AT&T number, but every service provider has one of these law enforcement customer service numbers to check up on these surveillance orders. And I got this number from, actually the DOJ gave this number to the ACLU in a FOIA response. So it's not like they're trying to hide these numbers. So not only do they not do any checks, but they're not even trying to hide the phone numbers. You can just search Google and get them on any service provider. So this is one example. I did a quick Google search and was able to get it. There's the number again. So again, I've never called this number, but I will introduce you to somebody who did call this number back in 2015. This is Mr. Anderson. And if you're thinking to yourself that that looks like a jailhouse selfie, it's definitely a jailhouse selfie. But that's beside the point. This guy, he's in jail right now, actually, in Missouri on 1,000-kilogram marijuana conspiracy, money laundering. And in 2015, he got upset over the government hiding surveillance data that was collected on his cell phone, something that I can relate to. Rather than wait for his attorney or the prosecutors to get this information and give it to him, he decided on May 8th of 2015 to use an inmate phone to three-way call that AT&T subpoena compliance number. And the call was recorded, and he had the transcripts transcribed, and he actually put them on the public record. And when he filed this, I just want to make clear that when he put this on the record, he said, I do not want this to be sealed. I want this to be public. So that's why I've pulled this off of the public record, and I'm showing everyone today. Here are some of the transcripts of this actual call that he did with AT&T, this three-way call. So there's an AT&T agent, Ronaldo, and he says, hello, how can I help you? Just no, I guess he did press 5. I'm not sure what that's about. So I guess you have to press 5, and then you can get it through to one of these agents. And he says, Ronaldo, how are you doing? Calling a reference to subpoena that was served on phone number 831, it's his number, for a toll registry. Agent Ronaldo says, well, let me take a look. He says, well, hold on, before you continue, let me just tell you, I'm also looking for Title III information, which is a wiretap. And basically, he instantly realized that he's hit pay dirt, and he's like, oh, well, maybe I want some more information here. Then the agent Ronaldo says, well, was that a separate request? Still no check, no, are you law enforcement, or nothing at all. Are you calling from a prison phone? No questions like that. But at one point, the agent does say, well, who am I speaking with today? And he says, you're speaking with Tom Anderson. He's telling the truth. That's who he is. He's Tom Anderson. And then that was enough to satisfy this guy. He says, okay, well, I don't see any mobile locate request in July for that. I'm sorry. He says, I do see a mobile locate request for that number. So now this guy who called from jail asking AT&T about surveillance on his own cell phone just got this AT&T agent to say, yes, there's been a mobile locate request on your phone, which could have been historical cell site information, maybe real-time information, could have been a Stingray, who knows? They didn't really get into the details. And then he goes on and says, I'm not seeing a Title III, so he just confirmed that there was no wiretap on his phone. So now this guy knows that there was a cell phone tracking order on his phone, and they weren't listening to his phone calls. And they says, yeah, he just confirms it was just that mobile locate. Finally, he says, well, let me ask, what agency do you represent? So after he gives up all the information, he says, well, why don't you just tell me which law enforcement agency you're calling from? And he says, I represent myself. I'm Tom Anderson. I'm the defendant. He doesn't lie. He tells the truth. Says, I just calling to get this information. Hopefully you can help me out. And I cut the transcripts off from there. You can get them from the public record. They're actually pretty entertaining if you want to read through the whole thing. But even after he identifies himself as the defendant in the case, and this is his number, they actually go on for another like 5 minutes about AT&T policy on different things, and he gives them a little bit more information. He kind of, the guy, the AT&T agent kind of stops providing information after that point, but he doesn't like hang up the phone or, you know, or anything like that. It just kind of goes on for a while. And again, this was this is like a couple years ago. I don't know if this is still going on or not, but it is pretty interesting. So that's everything. So thank you for listening to my talk.